It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 58. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to professional wrestling history from 1870 to 1930. I know I usually say 1920, but in all honesty, we've been going into the 20s now for quite a while. So it was time to update the blurb. And as you can hear, this will be the last solo episode probably for a while. We will be back in studio just next week, as a matter of fact. And I'll be able to have Dan in the studio again. We were going to do this episode on Skype, but we haven't been able to solve those audio problems yet, and I did not want another episode ruined by audio issues. So this will be a solo episode over the topic that I had talked about before, a very famous gambling ring in 1909 and 1910. And then next episode, which will be the second week in July 8th, Dan will be in studio with me. And then the two episodes after that, we'll probably have the whole gang back together. So hope you're looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to having the interaction again. I enjoy doing the podcasts a little bit more when I'm doing them with Dan or my sons. It's just not me kind of lecturing. I feel like a Professor Fuzzy Face of the history department giving lectures when I'm doing the solo episodes. But the audio issues were just too much to overcome. We think we have a workaround for the next time that happens, but we weren't able to implement it in time, quite frankly, because of my schedule right now. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about a gambling ring, but first I wanted to give an update besides just a podcast update. I know there's been a whole lot going on in both WWE and in AEW, and I know Dan will probably be busting a gut to talk about the stuff in AEW. It's not escaped our attention of how bad the ratings have been lately for AEW, or that the Janelle Grant lawsuit has been halted while the federal authorities are looking into Vince's activities around all of this. And I said from the beginning when Vince stepped down the first time that if all of the money that he paid in those hush money payments was from his personal account, then why would he need to pay back WWE? That did not make any sense. If all the money came purely from his personal account, why would he have to pay the company back in that situation? I guess we'll find out some clarity on that in the coming months as the federal investigation either ends up with some indictments or it grinds to a halt and they let the Janelle Grant case continue in civil court. As far as AEW and their ratings is concerned, we'll go more in depth into that in the next episode. The scary thing about, they were at 502,000 overall for this past week's Dynamite. They're starting to lose their core audience, which I didn't think that was possible. Tony really needs to start listening, just not filter out anything that's critical and only listen to the good things that he's hearing. He has a problem. It's obvious within the ratings because 502,000 means your hardcores are tuning out. They don't like what you're doing. So you need to look at what you've been doing with this whole Young Bucks angle involving Tony. They need to look at some of the things Jericho has been doing lately and then see why they're not able to leverage the people that the fans seem to be excited about in the beginning, like Will Ospreay, into bigger numbers on television and on pay-per-view. One of the things that is pretty obvious now is pro wrestling is really a niche interest for a very small group of people. I think there's a lot more people that used to like pro wrestling than there are that like pro wrestling today. I know that UFC and WWE kind of did a joint thing in Louisville a week or two ago, and the SmackDown drew about 10,000 fans to the arena that Friday. And then they set the all-time indoor attendance record in Louisville with the UFC event the next night, which really isn't that surprising anymore. UFC is one of the most popular spectator sports in the world, and pro wrestling is playing to a smaller audience all the time. WWE still has a decent sized audience. I mean, 3 million, 4 million fans for some of their television shows, but that's a drop in the bucket to how many people used to watch pro wrestling. Dan had quit watching. I quit watching. The only reason I started watching again is because of this podcast, really. Some people had recommended NXT to me about 2016, 2017, and I watched some of that, but I had stopped watching pro wrestling in the 20-teens, picked it up a little bit for a year or two, and then quit watching again, and only started watching because of the podcast we're doing. And we focus a lot more on earlier stuff back in the 80s when Dan and I were fans, as opposed to more modern stuff. Although I'm going to talk about a really horrible card in 1995 in the review segment this week. Pro wrestling now is a niche thing that, fewer and fewer people watch, and a lot of the most passionate fans about it like a style of wrestling I would have never watched. If it was just all high spots, gymnastics, and very, very poor community theater, when I started watching in the late 70s, early 80s, I wouldn't have watched it. Some of my favorite times with my oldest sister, Vicky, were us going to the wrestling matches at Kiel Auditorium, and those matches were put on like a sport, and that's why we enjoyed it so much. Today, even the fact that there's not much of a pretense is fine, because you can still suspend your disbelief. Even when they were trying to fool people, people weren't really fooled. Some were. They weren't completely fooling people. Today, though, when you see such obvious cooperation, it turns you off, or all the garbage matches where everybody's got to go through the furniture and do stunts. It just turns you off. I don't think that the modern style of pro wrestling, I think there's a very limited audience for that. And until it gets closer back to what it used to be, I don't think it's going to capture that big audience. I have hope. Under Paul Levesque, he was a fan of wrestling in the 80s. He understood it. That's why NXT was very popular. But it's an older demographic. Your audience is going to die out eventually if you're not making new fans. And I know that the WWE is one of the few companies that does that, but it's still a much smaller audience than it was 20, 30 years ago. So with that, let's kind of jump into the history topic this week, and then I will do the review and why I chose to review this event. The history subject I stumbled upon while doing the John Pesek book. John Pesek wrestled Marin Plastina in 1921 to settle a promotional war between Jack Curley and Tex Rickard, who's known more for boxing promotion than wrestling promotion. Plastina's manager was a gentleman by the name of Ole Marsh, but his real name is kind of obscure. It could have been Joe Carroll Marsh, which is what Wrestling Database credits it as. In the court case that I'm going to talk about, he was called George N. Marsh, and Ole was his nickname. But I've seen different variations of what his name could have been. People often went by multiple names in the professional wrestling business, and because this is before people were more easily identified, I don't know right now to this day what his actual name was. I'm going to go with George N. Marsh because he was in court and that's what he said his name was. But he could have been Joe Carroll Marsh. He could have been Joe Carroll. It's hard to say. But I had read a story from around the time of Pesach and Plastina, and they were talking about how, because as long as you go back and you research wrestling, I've found matches in the 1870s. There are newspaper reporters who doubt the legitimacy of those matches. The sport has always been tainted with charges of working the matches or fakery or hippodroming, depending on how antagonistic the newspaper reporter was to professional wrestling and how suspicious they were of the things that were going on in the ring or on mats in the 19th century for the most part. But I had read how Ole Marsh had spent 2 years in prison for putting on fake wrestling matches. Well, they don't put you in prison for putting on fake wrestling matches. They do put you in prison, though, if you took part in a gambling scheme to defraud other citizens and you used the U.S. mail in the furtherance of said scheme. And this story was a very nationally significant story in 1909 and 1910. The newspapers across the United States carried this story about this gambling ring. And as late as 1916, so this case was settled in March of 1910, as late as 1916, newspaper reporters are still trying to track down the leader of this ring, John Mabry, who they were referred to in the newspapers as Mabray, M-A-B-R-A-Y, but whose real name was John C. Mabry, M-B-R-Y. I'm sorry, M-A-B-R-Y. This is a thing that made headlines nationally. Mabry's ring did not just affect professional wrestling. It also involved professional boxing. It also involved professional horse racing. Mabry himself, by profession, was a livestock salesman. And he lived in Kansas City, but because he was a livestock salesman, he spent a lot of time on the road, and he hung around in gambling circles. So he was particularly well known in Council Bluffs, Iowa, Colorado, and New Orleans. And what he would do was he would organize schemes around sporting events. So when a horse race was coming up, if he could fix the horse race, he would. The professional wrestling and professional boxing, he would fix those fights or wrestling matches to favor the outcome he wanted for his gambling ring. And he frequently used pro wrestlers and pro wrestling managers to steer people into these gambling schemes, and they would lose. The highest amount I saw was $37,000, and $37,000 in 1910 is approximately $1,500,000 today. So these are not small amounts that they're betting. These are very large amounts that they're betting. And he would organize these schemes, and then he would pay the wrestler a percentage of what he brought in. So, giving a couple of examples. We know Ollie Marsh steered people into these schemes, but we don't know exactly what he did because he pled guilty and did not turn state's evidence. He just took the result of his guilty plea, which was 14 months in prison and a $1,500 fine. But we don't know what he actually did. But we do know what a couple of the wrestlers did. So Thomas Gay, who was a little-known wrestler out of Streator, Illinois, made the acquaintance of Mabry when he was in New Orleans. And he was wrestling down in New Orleans. Well, he meets up with Mabry. Mabry starts talking to him about the kind of money that they can make by guiding people into betting on these matches. And so he gets Gay to go back to Streator, Illinois, and recruit a couple of the wealthy citizens for a gambling scheme on a can't miss. Gay is scheduled to win this match in New Orleans. These the citizens can't lose, so they put up there's three of them, and they put up $14,000 on this wrestling match. No, not 14, 10,000. It was one of the more prominent citizens in Streator, Illinois. He puts up $10,000 in the wrestling match. Well, something happens, surprise, surprise, during the wrestling match. The wrestler falls out of the ring or something like that, strikes his head and can't continue. And, oh my goodness, Thomas Gay, who was supposed to lose this match, all of a sudden wins the match. And now this poor guy has lost $10,000 in a fluke freak accident. Well, the fluke freak accident that Mabry and the wrestlers had arranged leads that gambler to lose the $10,000, of which Mabry gives Gay $2,500 of it. A little more well-known wrestler was Ernest Fenby. Now, Ernest Fenby was what we would call a journeyman. He never rose above the opening match or the mid-card, but he did wrestle some of the more prominent wrestlers of the first decade of the 1900s and the 19-teens. He wrestled Vladek Zbyszko. I think he wrestled Stanislaw Zbyszko. He wrestled Ed Strangler Lewis, Joe Stecker, Pesek. He wrestled all the big-name wrestlers, usually losing. Well, almost always losing. I don't think he ever beat any of them. He was a mid-card wrestler at best, usually an opening match wrestler. He is from Shepherd, Michigan. So he and another, he's not a wrestler, but he's a friend of Fenby's, named James Kuhn. They convinced three citizens in Shepherd to bet on Fenby in this upcoming wrestling match. Those three citizens put up $14,000. Fenby gets some blood in like a balloon, some kind of bladder type object, and his opponent has it in his mouth, and at a certain time in the match when Fenby's supposed to lose, the opponent bites down on that balloon, it pops, the blood comes running out of their mouth, and it looks like they've got serious internal injuries. Well, the referee sees that. The match can't continue. The person's got serious internal injuries. We have to award the match to Fenby, who was supposed to lose, and that's what the three acquaintances of his and Kuhn's bet was $14,000 that Fenby would lose the match. Surprise, surprise. Fenby wins. They lose the $14,000, and Mabry gives Fenby $3,000, and he gives Kuhn $1,000 or $1,500, something like that. So the only reason we know that is both Gay and Fenby did testify, and neither of them received jail time for what they did. They were, I think, might have got fines, but they were let off leniently. The trial went from March 10th to March 20th, and all of the defendants were guilty of using the mail to further these gambling schemes because Fenby received his instructions from Mabry through the mail. Gay received the money, I believe, through the mail, or instructions on how to get the money from the mail. So they were using the mail for furtherance of this fraudulent scheme, which is what got them put into prison, not staging faked wrestling matches. Mabry gets 2 years and a $10,000 fine, as does 9 of his other defendants. And then the 2 other defendants that were considered part of the Big 12, which was his main gambling ring, they got a 1.5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. Mabry serves about 14 months, as do most of the other defendants. Nobody served their full sentence, and they all go back out of prison, and for the most part, they don't get in trouble anymore. It looks like they might have still been gambling, but Mabry doesn't organize any more gambling rings. You never even hear of him again after he gets out of prison. And some reporters did try to find him for a while after he got out of prison. But it seems like he was in his mid-40s, Mabry was, when he went into prison. It seems like the one time in prison was enough for him to decide he needed to do things differently and not expose himself to criminal charges. Ernest Femby goes back as a professional wrestler and wrestles throughout at least the teens and I think the 20s as well. And he's not really dogged by any of the allegations, nor is Marsh for the most part. That reporter bringing it up was the only thing I ever read about it, and reading 2 years worth of articles on Plastina and Marsh. And that's a lot of times what happens within history. If something is not that significant that a large number of people remember it and they talk about it every few years, these things are quickly forgotten. That's the problem of history. So much of it is lost and so little of it is captured. I don't know if we ever have a completely full picture of what happened historically. I will say that one thing I've learned over this past year is I don't believe anything I read anymore that I haven't personally researched, because something I've heard repeated in several books, including Luthez's book, including Fall Guys, and several other sources besides that, is that after the double cross in 1925, where Stanislaus Zbyszko beat Big Wayne Munn legitimately and took the world title from him, and then Zbyszko dropped his version of the world title. I'm skipping a part and step there. Because the promoters had varying degrees of strength with the different athletic commissions, the promoters were able to manipulate the athletic commissions to keep Zbyszko from being recognized as the undisputed champion. Basically, New York and Pennsylvania recognized Zbyszko. Michigan and Illinois recognized Big Wayne Munn. So when Stecher beat Zbyszko in May of 1925, he had the New York and Pennsylvania versions of the World Championship. And when Lewis beat Munn in May of 1925, he had the Michigan and Illinois versions of the world title. And that title would be divided for 3 years before Stecher and Lewis decided to have a contest in February 1928 in St. Louis to settle that promotional war. I have read that Lewis pretty much just went out and defended the title like he was still the world champion, but that Stecher was so afraid of double crosses that he pretty much retired the title. Some of that is true. Stecher's partners did try to double cross him, and he was concerned about double crosses, but he didn't retire the title. And in October 1926, when he lets Pesek put an armbar on him, or a hammerlock, depending on which newspaper report you read, and he forces Stecher to give up, but the referee goes ahead and disqualifies Pesek anyway, so the title does not switch hands, even though Pesek double-crossed Stecher and made him submit in the ring. Stecher did take 2 months off after that match, probably let his shoulder heal up, but he does not retire the belt. He has 25 title offenses at least in 1927. And Stecher wrestles some really big names during the 3 years that he has part of that divided title, including Jim Londas and Pesek 3 times. So the characterization that Stecher just retired the belt until he lost it to Lewis is not true. Both of them went out and defended it like it was a normal world championship. So I'm very careful now about what I'm saying. If I haven't researched it myself, I'm really going to be circumspect in whether I put that out there as fact or not. I think there's some allergen in here or something. I keep having to pause the recording to keep from coughing. So going forward, whenever I write books, sometimes it may sound a little different than something I wrote earlier. It's just because I'm getting a lot more dogged about what I say based on what I read as opposed to what I research. I will probably make this a short review. This is going to be a little bit of a short episode, probably about 30 minutes. I'm worried that our first episode back in the studio will probably be pretty long-winded next time. So you can look forward to a much longer episode on July 8th. And we will do 3 episodes in July because we have that 5th Monday on July 29th. So right now, one of the more popular shows on television is Who Killed WCW? And World Championship Wrestling is what the company evolved to after Jim Crockett Promotions sold to Turner Broadcasting at the end of 1988. Other than the 1 year that Ric Flair had the book in 1989, if you go back and you look at WCW after they sold, it was a terrible company with a terrible product and only improved briefly for a couple of months with the introduction of the NWO, or the Outsiders. The Outsiders is what made that angle interesting. But after Hogan joins and they have a cavalcade of people join them, it just got too busy, too junked up. And as everybody that I was talking to at the time said, how many times would you get jumped by this gang of hooligans before you started banding together with all your friends to protect each other from this gang of thugs? It just made all of the... because WCW was supposed to be the baby faces in this scenario, and it made them all look like idiots. To me, other than the brief couple-month period with the Outsiders in 96, WCW was not a good program from probably the end of 89 until it went out of business in 2001. And I had quit watching it completely in 1994 because my least favorite wrestler in the whole world came to WCW in the middle of 1994. As listeners to the show will know, and I will say, I think Vince had to have him for his promotion in the 80s to go where he wanted to go, because Vince's wrestling was all comic book wrestling, so Hogan fit right in there. And I don't think anybody else was a big enough star or had the cachet that Hogan had to take on the national expansion like he did. I thought the world of Paul Orndorff. I don't think he could have filled that role. But I always saw Hogan as bulk bogus. I had no use for him. And to Dan's consternation, when we were in St. Louis and we were right on the aisle seat, I let him know what I thought of him when he came down the aisle, and Dan thought we were going to get killed. In 93, Vince McMahon decides he needs to go in a different direction, and Hogan pretty much leaves WWE, but doesn't go to anywhere else at first. He's going to go pursue his acting. And it's while he's pursuing his acting that Eric Bischoff, who had just become the president of World Championship Wrestling, approaches him about wrestling for WCW. And Hogan agrees for huge money, and the first thing Bischoff does is have him beat Ric Flair, which no NWA fan ever wanted to see. We wanted to see Flair beat Hogan. So with Hogan there, I was pretty much done with him. And then they got the Nitro show in 95, and so I would watch a little bit of that occasionally. And then when the Outsiders came in 96, I did watch it regularly for a few years, even though I didn't think it was nearly as good as the WWF show by that time because of Bret Hart. The 80s comic book stuff had given way to some really good wrestling in the 90s with Bret Hart. He wasn't my cup of tea, but Shawn Michaels was very good as well. And then you had Stone Cold arrive in '96, and the company would really take off when he became such a huge star. And the in-ring was better. But I had not watched any of the pay-per-views in WCW for a very long time, and so I didn't see any of the pay-per-views in 1995. And so now that they're talking about who killed WCW and all of that, I know that 1995 was the lowest performing financial year for the WWE. They lost like $5 million, $6 million. They lost quite a bit of money that year. And I said, well, okay, that was WWE's worst performing year. I wonder what was going on with WCW, because I wasn't watching that at the time. So I watched the first pay-per-view for WCW in 1995, Super Brawl 5. And critics have not been kind to that show, and I can see why. It was not a good show. Hogan and Vader headlined the card, and I do have to say, Hogan stood in there for more of Vader's offense than a lot of people did. Shawn Michaels berated him so bad he was afraid to do anything because Vader was stiff. Bret Hart really liked him and said he was stiff. So, but Hogan stood in there and didn't seem to be complaining about anything, and they had a fairly decent match for what it was. But the match started out, the card started out with a match that got one of the guys fired, and it was Paul Roma versus Alex Wright. And Roma was supposed to put Wright over because ostensibly the WCW brain trust at the time thought that Wright could be built into such a star that he could take over from Hogan one day. I didn't know weed was legal in Georgia so early, but apparently it was, because I could see Alex Wright being a very solid mid-card babyface or heel, but I can't see him any higher than that. And when he jumped in the ring and started dancing, I cheered when Paul Roma hit him from behind and got some heat on him, because I didn't want to see the guy dancing around the ring. That being said, Roma didn't give him a whole lot of offense, and he does kick out at the end before the 3 count. It's really close. You can barely, but he kicks out at about 2.5. But the referee went ahead and counted 3, and they didn't show the replay because Bobby picked up on it. He says, "Hey, I want to see that replay." And Tony Schiavone said, "Well, you're not going to." And they did that, obviously, to hide the fact that he had kicked out at 2.5. And he received a letter from the WCW office the next day. His contract was expiring in March, and they told him, based on your actions in that Alexander Wright match on the pay-per-view, we are not going to renew your contract. So, and Paul Roma has admitted later on, Roma admitted that he didn't want to put Wright over and had kicked out on purpose. So he's got nobody to blame but himself. I don't see Alex Wright in that position. He didn't see Alex Wright in that position, but you don't get to make that decision. The second match was probably a decent Jim Duggan match because he was working with Bunkhouse Buck, but I didn't think much of the match at all, and I don't know how many stars Dave Meltzer would have given it, but I wouldn't give it more than 1 or 2. And I think it was the third match, was between Harlem Heat and the Nasty Boys, and I'm not watching any Nasty Boys matches, so I didn't even bother to watch this one. So don't care who won, don't care what the outcome was. Next match. The next match, to me, was the best match on the whole card, and that was Dustin Rhodes versus Blacktop Bully, which was Barry Darsow, and one of his many different gimmicks. This horrible gimmick was put on him by the WCW office, so I don't think we can blame him. But Dustin again shows that he was not a nepotism project. I think he unfairly gets tagged with that because of his WCW days. But Dustin was good in the ring already. He was the natural, and he did a really good job. Barry Darsow never got over outside of the tag team with Axe in WWF. But he had a good, credible match here with Dustin. And he actually wins the match on a screwjob finish. But for my money, it was the best match of the night. And if anything surprised me on this card, it was that match. Because I've always thought Dustin could wrestle. I haven't thought much of Barry Darsow outside of being Smash and Demolition. And this match was a lot better than it should have been. The next match surprised me the other way. It was Macho Man Randy Savage's pay-per-view debut in WCW. And Macho Man at this time, early 40s, I think. Yeah, he would have been 40 or 41. And he's wrestling with Sting as his tag team partner against Big Bubba Rogers, Earthquake, John Tenta, who I think was a different name in this one, but it's John Tenta, former sumo wrestler. And this match was a bunch of high spots with Tenta and Big Bubba Rogers getting very little offense, and Sting and Macho Man going over. It wasn't much of a match, and definitely not what I was expecting out of Savages, whose matches are usually meticulous. It wasn't, I can't say it was bad. It just was not very compelling. It was more high spots than a good story. And then, as I've said, Bulk Bogus did better with Vader than he probably should have. And that was a pretty good match, too. So if you were going to go back and look at this and you wanted to see, what matches should I watch? Definitely I would say Dustin versus Blacktop Bully, Hogan versus Vader, if you're so inclined. And then for the unique place it played on that pay-per-view, and because I always thought Paul Roma was an underrated talent, you might want to check out the Roma Alex Wright match to start the pay-per-view. Overall, I gave the pay-per-view a big thumbs down. None of the matches were particularly compelling. If I was sitting there and I had to decide whether to invest my time in watching that or going out and doing something else, playing at the time, I would have been in 95. I could have went out and played golf, went to the gym. There's a lot of things I could have done. I probably would have chosen those. So it was a pretty bad card. I've looked further into 95 and some of those look even worse. So this was probably a good one to check out. But that probably will be the end of my WCW 95 reviews. I think when Dan comes back, we're going to start getting back into some of the territory reviews or some of the stuff from the 1950s, because we've been watching some of that. So I think that I will leave it there. I hope you all have a wonderful summer so far, and we'll see you in the next podcast. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.